In the vast Mongolian steppes of 1162, a child entered the world gripping a blood clot, a sign, the shamans declared, that he would conquer all beneath the eternal blue sky. Tonight, we'll follow the extraordinary path of Temujin as he transformed from an outcast boy into Genghis Khan, master of the largest contiguous empire in human history. And if stories like this help you to unwind at the end of your day, a quiet like and subscribe would help this channel reach other history lovers seeking peaceful sleep. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it in your corner of the world? Now settle in, perhaps with some gentle background noise to accompany our journey, and close your eyes as we trace the rise of an empire that would stretch from the Korean peninsula to the heart of Hungary. The Mongolian steppes in 1162 were no place for the weak. Endless grasslands stretched beyond the horizon, where survival meant everything and mercy meant nothing. Into this harsh world came a boy whose birth would echo through centuries. His father, Yesügei, was a minor chieftain of the Börte tribe. His mother, Hoelun, had been kidnapped from another tribe, a common practice that would later shape her son's views on power and taking what you wanted. When the child arrived, gripping that mysterious blood clot, they named him Temujin, after a Tatar warrior his father had recently defeated. The shamans whispered among themselves. Blood in a newborn's hand meant one thing. This child would spill much blood in his lifetime, but they could never have imagined just how much. Life in a Mongol camp moved with the seasons. In summer, families followed their herds across vast grasslands, living in felt tents called jirs that could be taken down and rebuilt in less than an hour. Winter brought brutal cold that could kill unprepared travelers in a single night. Children learned early that weakness meant death, not just for themselves, but for their entire family. The Mongols believed the sky god Tengri watched over them, but his protection came only to those strong enough to earn it. Every morning, they would pour mare's milk into the wind as an offering, asking for good weather and victory over their enemies. Death was not feared, but respected. Warriors who died in battle would feast forever in the eternal blue sky. Their daily life revolved around their animals. Horses were not just transportation, but partners in survival. A Mongol without a horse was a dead man walking. They drank mare's milk, both fresh, and fermented into an alcoholic drink called aerag. When meat was scarce, they would cut a small vein in their horse's neck and drink the blood, then seal the wound, keeping both rider and horse alive. Temujin's early years were spent learning the ways of the steppe, how to ride before he could properly walk, how to shoot an arrow with deadly accuracy while galloping at full speed, how to survive when the winter winds could freeze a man solid in minutes. His father taught him that loyalty was earned through strength, and that enemies were simply future allies who hadn't yet been conquered. The boy learned to read the sky like a book. A certain cloud formation meant snow was coming. The way the grass bent told him which direction the wind would blow. He could track a single horse across miles of grassland by the depth of its hoofprints in the soil. These skills seemed simple, but they would one day help him outmaneuver armies 10 times larger than his own. Temujin had 3 younger brothers, Asa, Hachiun, and Temuge, and one half-brother, Begter, who was older and stronger. Even as children, competition was fierce. Food was often scarce, and the strongest ate first. When they hunted small game with their bows, arguments over who shot which animal could turn violent. This harsh reality would soon teach Temujin his first lesson about the price of survival. Mongol children played games that prepared them for war. They wrestled until someone couldn't get up. They raced their horses across dangerous terrain where a single mistake meant broken bones or death. They practiced sneaking up on each other, learning skills that would later help them surprise enemy camps in the dead of night. His father began arranging his future early, including a marriage alliance with a 9-year-old girl named Börte from the Conqueror tribe. At age 9, Temujin was taken to meet his future bride, beginning the political connections that would shape his destiny. But first, his childhood was about to end in the most brutal way possible. Chapter 2. Betrayal and Exile, 1171 to 1180. When Temujin turned 9, his father decided it was time to secure his future. The journey to meet Börte and her family would take several days across the steppes. Father and son rode together, talking about the responsibilities that would come with marriage and leadership. Yesügei spoke of the alliances that kept their tribe strong, the enemies who waited for any sign of weakness, and the delicate balance of power that ruled their world. The meeting with Börte's family went well. She was intelligent for her age, with bright eyes that missed nothing. Her father, Dei Sechen, was impressed with young Temujin and agreed to the marriage when both children came of age. As was custom, Temujin would stay with Börte's family for a time to prove his worth. But first, Yesügei wanted to return home to handle urgent tribal matters. But on the return journey, everything changed. As they rode across a familiar valley, they spotted smoke rising from cooking fires. A group of Tatar travelers had made camp near a stream. Yesügei recognized the danger immediately. The Tatars were ancient enemies of his tribe, but to ride around them would take an extra day, and refusing their hospitality if they offered it would be seen as cowardice. The Tatars called out greetings as father and son approached. Their leader, an older man with scars covering his hands, smiled and invited them to share their evening meal. Yesügei studied their faces carefully. These men seemed genuine in their welcome, and turning down food from fellow travelers was against the sacred laws of the steppes. He accepted their offer, but kept his sword loose in its sheath. The Tatars served them roasted mutton and fermented mare's milk. The conversation was polite, focusing on weather patterns and the movement of herds. But Yesügei noticed something troubling: the way they looked at each other when they thought he wasn't watching. Quick glances filled with meaning he couldn't quite understand. What he didn't know was that these Tatars had not forgotten that he once killed one of their warriors in battle, the very man Temujin was named after. They had recognized him immediately. Revenge was not just acceptable among the steppes tribes. It was a sacred duty that could wait years or even decades to be fulfilled. They had been carrying a special poison for months, waiting for exactly this opportunity. It was made from a rare plant that grew only in certain valleys, mixed with powdered bones from a wolf. The poison worked slowly, causing intense pain that looked like a natural illness. By the time the victim realized what was happening, it was far too late. The eldest Tatar, whose brother had died under Yesügei's sword 15 years earlier, personally prepared the final bowl of mare's milk. As he stirred in the poison, he whispered a prayer to his ancestors, asking them to witness this moment of justice. The powder dissolved completely, leaving no trace of what was to come. They slipped it into the last bowl of mare's milk they served him. By the time father and son left the Tatar camp and continued toward home, Yesügei was already feeling the first effects, a burning sensation in his stomach that he blamed on the rich food. Then came the dizziness, which he told himself was just fatigue from the long journey. But as they rode through the night, the symptoms grew worse. His hands began to shake so violently he could barely hold his horse's reins. Sweat poured down his face despite the cool evening air. When they stopped to rest at dawn, he could barely stand. Young Temujin watched his father with growing terror. This was not simple illness. Something was very wrong. He tried to help his father stay on his horse, but Yesügei's strength was fading fast. The man who had seemed invincible just hours before could now barely speak. By the time they reached home, Yesügei was dying. His skin had turned grey, and blood appeared at the corners of his mouth when he coughed. Hoelun took one look at her husband and knew their world was about to collapse. She had seen poison work before. The symptoms were unmistakable, but the poison worked slowly enough to give him time for one final act as chieftain. With tremendous effort, he called for his most trusted ally, Targutai of the Tayichiud tribe. Targutai had been his friend since childhood, had fought beside him in countless battles, and had sworn blood oaths of loyalty that were supposed to last beyond death itself. When Targutai arrived and saw Yesügei's condition, his mind immediately began calculating. He knelt beside his dying friend and listened as Yesügei spoke in gasps about duty and honor. But behind his concerned expression, Targutai was already seeing possibilities that had nothing to do with loyalty. With his final breaths, his voice barely a whisper, Yesügei begged Targutai to protect his family and help young Temujin claim his rightful place as chieftain. He reminded Targutai of their friendship, of the victories they had shared, of the promises they had made to each other's families. Targutai looked into his dying friend's eyes and swore he would honor every word. He even wept as he made this promise, and his tears were real. He had genuinely loved Yesügei like a brother, but love and ambition can exist in the same heart. And on the steps, power was more valuable than sentiment. 3 days later, Yesügei was dead. Targutai agreed to lead the funeral ceremony and spoke beautifully about loyalty, honor, and the bonds that held their people together. He described Yesügei as a great leader whose spirit would watch over them from the eternal blue sky. The entire tribe mourned, and even former enemies came to pay their respects. But even as he spoke these words, Targutai was already planning his betrayal. During the funeral feast, he studied each of Yesügei's followers, deciding which ones would be most useful to his own ambitions. He noted who controlled the best herds, who commanded respect among the warriors, who might resist his plans. The moment the funeral fires burned out, Targutai began his work. Why serve a child when he could simply take everything for himself? Temujin was just a boy with no experience and no power base. His mother was an outsider with no family connections to protect her. The other sons were too young to pose any threat. Within days, Targutai began visiting Yesügei's followers one by one, convincing them to abandon the family and join his tribe instead. He was clever about it. He didn't simply demand their loyalty. Instead, he painted a picture of the future that made following him seem like the only sensible choice. To the warriors, he spoke of the raids they could conduct against wealthy tribes, the glory they could win in battle. To the herders, he promised better grazing lands and protection from thieves. To everyone, he offered security that a widow and her children simply couldn't provide. He also spread whispers about Hoelun herself. She was from the Olkanud tribe, he reminded people. Outsiders who couldn't be trusted. Perhaps Yesügei's death was somehow her fault. Perhaps the family was cursed. Perhaps following them would bring only misfortune. One by one, they left. First the warriors, then the herders, then even the servants. They took their horses, their weapons, and most importantly, their loyalty with them. Each departure made the next one easier to justify. After all, why should they be the only ones to suffer with a dying tribe? Some felt guilt as they packed their belongings. They remembered Yesügei's kindness, his courage in battle, his generosity with captured wealth. But guilt was a luxury they couldn't afford when winter was coming and survival was at stake. Temujin went from future chieftain to outcast overnight. His mother, once the respected wife of a leader, now faced starvation with 5 young children and no protection. The great herds that had sustained their family were driven away. Hundreds of horses, thousands of sheep and goats, all disappeared in the space of a few days. The warm gears were packed up and taken to new camps. The servants who had prepared their meals and maintained their weapons simply vanished one morning. Even their weapons were claimed by men who said Yesügei had owed them debts that had never existed but couldn't be disputed by a powerless widow. When Temujin tried to assert his authority as his father's heir, Targutai laughed in his face. The boy was nothing now, he said, just another mouth to feed in a world that had no room for weakness. If he wanted to lead, he would have to prove himself like any other man. But how could a child with no followers, no wealth, and no weapons prove anything at all? The final insult came when Targutai's men took even their winter supplies, the dried meat and fermented milk that would have kept them alive through the cold months. They left the family with nothing but a single worn tent, a few broken tools, and the clothes on their backs. As Targutai rode away with the last of their possessions, Hoelun stood watching with her children beside her. The woman who had once commanded servants now faced a future of digging for roots and begging for scraps. Her eldest son, who should have inherited leadership of hundreds of people, was now responsible for keeping his family from starving to death. But as young Temujin watched his father's so-called friend disappear over the hills, something cold and hard settled in his chest. This betrayal would teach him lessons that no amount of success could have provided. He was learning that promises meant nothing without power to enforce them. That loyalty could be bought and sold like any other commodity. that the only person he could truly trust was himself. The boy who would become Genghis Khan was beginning to understand how the world really worked. Chapter 3. Survival of the Outcasts, 1180 to 1184. Winter on the Mongolian steppes could kill a healthy warrior in a single night. For a widow and 5 children with no shelter, no food, and no protection, it should have been impossible to survive. But Hoelun refused to let her family die. She had been raised as a chieftain's daughter before her kidnapping, and she remembered every survival skill her people had taught her. She became both mother and teacher, showing her children how to read the landscape for hidden opportunities that others would miss. She taught her children to dig for roots with their bare hands, scraping away frozen earth until their fingers bled. Wild onions grew in certain valley bottoms. Sweet roots could be found near streams, but only if you knew which plants to follow underground. They caught fish with traps made from their torn clothing, weaving the fabric into nets that could be hidden beneath ice. When they found a dead animal, they ate every part of it, meat, organs, even the marrow from cracked bones. Hoelun showed them how to crack bones properly to get the rich marrow inside, how to cook organs so they wouldn't make them sick, how to dry meat so it would last for days instead of rotting within hours. The children learned to see food where others saw nothing. Mice and rats became delicacies. Certain types of grass could be eaten raw or boiled into soup. Even insects provided protein when nothing else was available. Tree bark could fill an empty stomach, though it tasted terrible and provided little nutrition. Temujin learned to hunt small game with a bow made from bent wood and strings pulled from their tent. His aim improved rapidly when missing meant going hungry. He could track a rabbit across rocky ground by the smallest scratches its claws left on stones. He learned to move silently, to wait motionless for hours, to strike with deadly accuracy when the moment came. His younger brothers gathered dried grass and animal dung for fuel. They became experts at finding dry fuel even in wet weather, at starting fires with nothing but flint and patience, at keeping flames alive through wind and rain. Fire meant the difference between cooked food and raw meat, between warmth and freezing to death. They moved constantly, always searching for food, always hiding from the tribes that might kill them just for being weak. They learned to read the signs that other people had passed through an area, horse droppings that showed which direction travelers had gone, cold fire pits that revealed where camps had been set up, broken branches that marked paths through difficult terrain. The family developed a system for survival that kept them alive when it should have been impossible. They took turns staying awake at night, watching for danger. They cached small amounts of food in hidden locations, spreading their supplies so that losing one hiding place wouldn't mean starvation. They learned to disappear at the first sign of other people, melting into the landscape like ghosts. But the worst part wasn't the hunger or the cold, it was the shame. Every time they saw riders in the distance, they had to run and hide like criminals. These were often people who had once bowed to Yesügei, who had eaten at their table and called them friends. Now the same people would kill them without hesitation if they discovered the family's location. Temujin, who had been raised to lead men into battle, now spent his days digging for worms and stealing scraps from abandoned camps. He had to swallow his pride every time they crept into a deserted campsite to search for forgotten food. The boy, who should have been learning strategy and leadership, was instead learning to scavenge, like a wild animal. The psychological toll was enormous. Temujin's younger brothers sometimes cried themselves to sleep, remembering when they had warm beds and full stomachs. But crying was a luxury they couldn't afford. Tears wasted water and attracted predators, both animal and human. But their mother never let them forget who they were. Even as they ate grass soup and slept on frozen ground, she reminded them they were the sons of Yesügei. She told them stories of their father's victories, of the noble lineage that ran in their blood, of the great destiny that awaited them if they could just survive long enough to claim it. She had noble blood, she told them. They had a right to rule. The people who had abandoned them were not their betters. They were cowards who had chosen the easy path. Someday, she promised, her sons would reclaim what was stolen from them, and those who had betrayed their family would pay the price for their treachery. These speeches kept the children going when their bodies wanted to give up. Hoelun understood that survival was as much about mental strength as physical endurance. If her sons started thinking of themselves as beggars, they would remain beggars forever. But if they remembered they were princes in exile, they might someday become kings. The breaking point came during their second winter of exile. Food was almost impossible to find, and the younger children were growing weak. Their clothes were falling apart. Their shoes had worn through completely, and their single tent had so many holes it provided little protection from the wind. Temujin and his half-brother Begter had been competing over every scrap, every opportunity to hunt, every chance to prove themselves the stronger. The competition had grown more intense as food became scarcer. Both boys were entering adolescence. Both felt the pressure to be the family's primary provider, and both resented sharing resources when there wasn't enough for everyone. The tension exploded during a hunting trip that should have fed the family for days. Temujin had been tracking a large bird for hours, moving carefully through tall grass, waiting for the perfect shot. Just as he drew his bow, Begter appeared from another direction and fired his own arrow. Both arrows struck the bird almost simultaneously. Both boys claimed the kill. Both refused to back down. This wasn't just about one meal. It was about who would lead the family, who had the right to make decisions, who deserved respect. The argument grew louder and more bitter. Begter was older and stronger, and he had always treated Temujin as a younger brother who needed to learn his place. Temujin, however, was his father's heir and believed that gave him authority over everyone in the family, including his half-brother. In that moment, something cold and calculating took over Temujin's mind. This wasn't just about a dead bird. This was about power, about survival, about who would determine the family's future. There could only be one leader, and leaders were not chosen by age or size. They were chosen by who was willing to do whatever it took to win. He drew his bow and aimed it not at game, but at Begter. His half-brother saw what was happening and had just enough time to understand that Temujin was serious. The arrow found its mark. Begter died instantly, the bird forgotten in the grass beside him. When Hoelun found out what her son had done, she was horrified. She had lost her husband to poison, her tribe to betrayal, and now one son had killed another. She screamed at Temujin, calling him a monster, a killer of his own blood. How could he murder the boy who had helped keep them alive? But Temujin showed no remorse. The strong survived, he told her. The weak died. That was the only law that mattered in their world. Begter had challenged his authority, and challenges to authority had to be met with decisive action. If he had shown mercy, if he had backed down, the rest of the family would have seen weakness. And weakness, as they had all learned, was a death sentence. His younger brothers watched this exchange in terror. They had just learned that their eldest brother was capable of killing family members who got in his way. From that moment on, they would never again question his decisions or compete with him for leadership. The lesson was clear. Temujin would do absolutely anything to survive and to rule. Chapter 4. The Prisoner's Escape, 1184 to 1186. The murder of Begter sent ripples across the steppes. Word spread quickly among the scattered tribes that Yesügei's son had killed his own brother. In a culture where family bonds were sacred, this was shocking news that traveled faster than wildfire. Some called it proof that the boy was dangerous, a future tyrant who would kill anyone who stood in his way. Others saw it as evidence that he was weak. Only a coward would kill family instead of facing real enemies. The shamans whispered that the spirits were angry, that such a violation of natural law would bring curses upon anyone who associated with the family. But there were also those who saw something else in the story. They remembered that Begter had been the older and stronger brother. They noted that Temujin had not killed him in rage, but with cold calculation. This suggested a kind of ruthless intelligence that might be useful in a leader if properly controlled. Targutai heard the news and realized he had made a serious mistake. He had dismissed Temujin as harmless, assuming that a starving boy posed no threat to anyone. But a boy willing to kill his own blood was not harmless at all. He was unpredictable, desperate, and growing stronger each day he survived in the wilderness. Worse, other tribes were starting to whisper that maybe the rightful heir of Yesügei deserved more respect than they had shown. Some of Yesügei's former allies were feeling guilty about abandoning his family. Others were wondering if they had backed the wrong leader when they chose Targutai over the legitimate heir. These whispers made Targutai nervous. His authority depended on everyone believing that following him had been the smart choice. If people started thinking that Temujin might actually reclaim his father's position someday, they might begin to hedge their bets. In politics, that kind of doubt could be fatal. Targutai decided the problem needed to be solved permanently. He gathered a war party of his most trusted warriors and rode out to find the family's camp. Finding them wasn't difficult. Desperate people left obvious trails, and the family's constant movement had been tracked by hunters and herders across the region. When they discovered Hoelun and her children hiding in a forest grove near a small stream, Targutai announced that he had come not as an enemy, but as a protector of tribal law. Temujin, he declared, was now a criminal who threatened the peace of all tribes. The boy had committed fratricide, the most serious crime in their culture. He would be taken into custody for his own good and the safety of others. Hoelun knew this was a lie. She also knew there was nothing she could do to stop 30 armed warriors from taking her son. She watched helplessly as they surrounded the camp, their weapons drawn, their faces showing no mercy. Temujin knew this was a lie too. He also knew the prisoners of the Tayichiud tribe rarely lived long enough to prove their innocence. Targutai would keep him alive just long enough for people to forget about him. Then he would suffer a convenient accident, a fall from a horse perhaps, or an illness that looked natural but came from poison. As the warriors closed in, Temujin looked at his mother one last time. He could see the fear in her eyes, but also a kind of desperate hope. If he surrendered, he would die. If he ran, she and his brothers might be punished for his escape. But if he stayed, they would all be at Targutai's mercy forever. He made a choice that would define everything that came after. He abandoned his family and ran into the deepest part of the forest. The decision tore at his heart, but it was strategically sound. Targutai had come for him specifically. If he wasn't there to capture, the man would have no reason to harm the others. And if Temujin could somehow survive and grow strong, he could return to rescue them later. For 9 days, he hid among the rocks and trees, while Targutai's men hunted him like an animal. They knew the forest better than he did, having grown up in this region. They could read tracks that were invisible to him, follow scents he couldn't detect, predict his movements based on the terrain. Slowly, methodically, they closed off every escape route. They posted guards at stream crossings, blocked paths through the valleys, watched the caves where a desperate fugitive might try to hide. The forest that had seemed like salvation became a prison with walls that grew smaller each day. Temujin survived on berries and stream water. He slept in hollow logs and crevices between rocks. When he heard the hunters coming, he would bury himself under leaves or press himself against cliff faces, holding his breath until they passed. Several times, they came within arm's reach without seeing him, but exhaustion was taking its toll. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in over a week. His clothes were torn by thorns and rocks. His feet were bleeding from walking on rough ground without proper shoes. On the 9th night, as he stumbled through darkness toward what he hoped was another hiding place, he walked straight into a trap. The warriors had been waiting for him, knowing that hunger and fatigue would eventually drive him toward the stream where they had positioned themselves. When he collapsed from exhaustion, just yards from the water, they surrounded him with weapons drawn. Temujin was finally captured. Targutai had him fitted with a wooden collar called a cangue, a heavy board that locked around his neck with iron pins. The device was cunningly designed to make life miserable without actually killing the prisoner. It was too heavy to allow comfortable sleep, too awkward to allow normal eating, too cumbersome to allow any kind of normal movement. The collar was designed to break a prisoner's spirit slowly, making them beg for mercy and accept their powerless position. Most captives lasted only a few days before they were willing to promise anything in exchange for its removal. But Temujin refused to break, even with the wooden collar weighing down his shoulders, even as the other prisoners mocked him and called him a kinslayer, even as the guards treated him like garbage and fed him scraps that weren't fit for dogs. He never begged for mercy. Instead, he watched everything. He learned the guards' routines, who was lazy, who was cruel, who might be sympathetic. He studied the layout of the camp, noting where weapons were stored, where horses were kept, which paths led to freedom. He memorized the personalities of everyone around him, filing away information that might someday be useful. He discovered that one of the guards had served under his father years earlier. The man felt guilty about Temujin's situation, but was too afraid of Targutai to help openly. Another guard was greedy and might be bribed if Temujin ever had anything to offer. A third was simply stupid and might be fooled by a clever plan. Most importantly, he learned that the entire tribe would be celebrating the summer solstice in a few weeks. During the celebration, discipline would be relaxed, guards would be drinking, and attention would be focused on festivities rather than security. He waited for the perfect moment. And then, during the celebration when most of the tribe was drunk on fermented mare's milk and distracted by wrestling matches and storytelling contests, he struck. The guard assigned to watch the prisoners that night was the stupid one, exactly as Temujin had hoped. The man had been drinking heavily and was more interested in the celebration than his duties. When he dozed off near midnight, Temujin began working on his escape. Using the heavy collar as a weapon, he managed to knock out the sleeping guard with a single, precise blow. The wooden board that had been his torment became his salvation, providing enough weight to render a man unconscious without killing him outright. Moving as quietly as possible despite the awkward collar, Temujin made his way to the edge of the camp. He couldn't remove the cangue without tools, but he could still move if he was careful. Every step had to be planned, every movement calculated to avoid making noise that would alert other guards. He slipped past the sleeping camp and disappeared into the night, the celebration continuing behind him as if nothing had happened. It would be hours before anyone discovered he was gone, and by then he would be far away. The escape was just the beginning of his problems. Now every tribe in the region would be hunting for him. Targutai would be furious at being made to look foolish, and his reputation for controlling prisoners would be damaged. He would spare no effort to recapture the boy who had embarrassed him. But Temujin had learned something crucial during his imprisonment. He had discovered that people feared him, not because he was strong, but because he was unpredictable. Fear, he realized, could be more powerful than any weapon, and a man who had nothing left to lose was the most dangerous kind of enemy. Chapter 5. The Path Back to Power, 1186 to 1196. Freedom came with a price. Temujin was alone on the steps, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a wooden collar he couldn't remove. The heavy cangue made every movement awkward and painful, marking him as an escaped prisoner to anyone who saw him. Every tribe knew his face, and most would kill him for the substantial bounty Targutai had placed on his head. The first challenge was simply surviving day to day. He couldn't approach settlements or camps without risking capture. He had to avoid the main travel routes where bounty hunters might be waiting. Food was almost impossible to find without proper hunting equipment, and the collar made it nearly impossible to hunt effectively even when he found small game. For weeks, he lived like a ghost on the edges of civilization. He learned to move only at night, to sleep in hidden places during the day, to survive on whatever scraps he could find or steal. Several times, he came close to being caught by search parties who were systematically combing the region for him. But desperation breeds creativity, and Temujin had inherited his father's intelligence along with his position. He remembered his father's teachings about alliances and the complex web of relationships that held the steppes together. Most importantly, he remembered that his father had arranged a marriage for him years earlier. He decided to take the greatest gamble of his young life. He would return to Börte's family and ask them to honor the marriage agreement his father had made when he was just 9 years old. The journey to the Conqueror tribe took him across dangerous territory where several different groups were actively hunting for him. He traveled mostly at night, following stars and landmarks his father had taught him to read. The wooden collar made travel exhausting, but it also served as a kind of disguise. Most people assumed escaped prisoners were too desperate and frightened to attempt anything as bold as claiming a bride. When he finally reached the Conqueror camp, he faced his next challenge, convincing them not to turn him in for the reward. He approached at dawn when the camp was just waking up, walking directly to the chief's tent with as much dignity as a man wearing a prisoner's collar could manage. It should have been suicide. He was a fugitive with no wealth, no followers, and no prospects. His family was scattered and powerless. His enemies controlled most of the region. What father would give his daughter to such a man? Most chiefs would have killed him on sight or handed him over to Targutai immediately. But Dei Sechen, Börte's father, was not most chiefs. He was known for his wisdom and his ability to see potential where others saw only problems. When his guards brought the young fugitive before him, Dei Sechen studied Temujin carefully. What he saw impressed him. This boy had survived everything the steppes could throw at him: betrayal, starvation, exile, imprisonment, and pursuit by professional warriors. That kind of resilience was incredibly rare and incredibly valuable. More importantly, Temujin had chosen to come here rather than flee to distant lands where he might be safe. That showed both courage and loyalty to old promises. Dei Sechen also understood something about power that many chiefs missed. The wheel of fortune turned quickly on the steppes. Today's outcast could become tomorrow's Khan, and today's Khan could become tomorrow's corpse. Betting on Temujin was risky, but the potential rewards were enormous. If the boy somehow managed to reclaim his father's position, the Conqueror tribe would be his most favored allies. After consulting with his advisors and his wife, Dei Sechen made a decision that shocked everyone in the camp. He would honor the old agreement. The marriage would proceed. The announcement caused tremendous controversy within the tribe. Many people thought their chief had lost his mind. Others worried that harboring a fugitive would bring Targutai's wrath down on all of them. Some of the younger warriors muttered about challenging Dei Sechen's leadership if he went through with this foolish plan. But Dei Sechen had made his choice. and he was not a man who changed his mind easily. He ordered his people to help remove Temujin's wooden collar, using tools and techniques that took hours of careful work. When the hated cangue finally fell away, Temujin wept, not from pain, but from relief and gratitude. The marriage took place in secret, with only a handful of witnesses and none of the usual festivities. Too much celebration would attract attention they couldn't afford, and too many people knew about the substantial bounty on Temujin's head. Börte was now 16, no longer the child Temujin had met years earlier. She had grown into an intelligent and strong-willed young woman who understood exactly what she was getting into. She had waited for Temujin through all the years of his family's exile, believing that the boy who had impressed her father would someday reclaim his destiny. She could have married any number of wealthy and powerful young men during the years of Temujin's exile. Several chiefs had approached her father with generous offers for her hand, but she had insisted on waiting, partly out of loyalty to the old agreement, but mostly because she had seen something in the young Temujin that others had missed. During the simple ceremony, she looked into her new husband's eyes and saw not a desperate fugitive, but a future conqueror. She understood that she was not just marrying a man. She was joining her fate to someone who would either die young or change the world forever. Their wedding gift came from an unexpected source. Börte's mother, a practical woman who rarely showed emotion, gave them a black sable coat that had been in her family for generations. It was the most valuable thing the family owned, worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. The coat was not just a gift, it was a statement. It showed that Börte's family was fully committed to Temujin's success, willing to invest their most precious possession in his future. More importantly, it gave him something he desperately needed, a symbol of wealth and status that could open doors and command respect. With this coat, Temujin made his first calculated move back toward power. He knew that surviving as a fugitive was not enough. He needed allies, followers, and legitimacy. Most importantly, he needed someone with enough power to protect him while he rebuilt his strength. He decided to approach Toghrul, Khan of the Karatis, who had been his father's sworn brother and one of the most powerful leaders in the region. This was another enormous gamble. Toghrul might honor old friendships, or he might see an opportunity to collect Targutai's bounty and eliminate a potential future threat. The journey to Toghrul's camp was nerve-wracking. Temujin traveled with only a small escort from Börte's family, carrying the precious sable coat and rehearsing the speech that might save his life or seal his doom. Everything depended on his ability to convince a powerful man to risk his reputation and resources on an exiled teenager. When he finally stood before Toghrul in the great Khan's tent, Temujin presented the sable coat not as a bribe, but as a gift between equals. He spoke not as a supplicant begging for help, but as Yesügei's rightful heir demanding that old promises be honored. He reminded Toghrul of the oath of brotherhood the two men had sworn years earlier, and of the obligations that oath created for both their families. Toghrul was impressed by the young man's boldness and dignity. Here was a teenager with nothing but a borrowed coat and a price on his head, Yet he spoke like a chieftain and demanded respect like a king. The old Khan remembered Yesügei fondly and had always felt guilty about not helping his family after his death. Against all logic and the advice of his counselors, Toghrul agreed to help. He would provide Temujin with protection, supplies, and most importantly, legitimacy. Having the Khan of the Karites as a patron would make other tribes think twice about attacking or betraying the young exile. The first recruits came slowly and from unexpected sources. A few young men who had nothing to lose and everything to gain by following a leader who might reward early loyalty with the high positions. Some former followers of his father who had lived with guilt for years and saw this as a chance to redeem themselves. Warriors who were impressed by his survival story and wanted to see what he might accomplish began to trickle into his camp. These were not the elite fighters of established tribes, but rather the desperate, the ambitious, and the outcast. Men who understood that following a conventional path would never make them wealthy or respected. Temujin's real breakthrough came when he rescued the son of another chieftain from Merkid kidnappers. The rescue operation was perfectly planned and executed, swift, brutal, and completely successful. A small force of his followers struck the Merkid camp at dawn, killed the guards, and freed the captive before the rest of the tribe could organize a response. Word spread quickly across the steppes that Yesügei's son was not just a survivor, but a tactical genius who could achieve the impossible against overwhelming odds. The rescue demonstrated everything potential followers wanted to see: intelligence, courage, loyalty to allies, and the ability to deliver results. More importantly, he had proven that following him could be profitable and relatively safe. The grateful father rewarded Temujin with horses, weapons, silver, and most crucially, public recognition of his abilities. Other warriors began to see him not as a desperate outcast, but as a rising power worth joining before his success made him too important to notice them. The rescue also established Temujin's reputation for keeping his word and protecting those who trusted him. In a world where betrayal was common and loyalty was expensive, this reputation was worth more than gold. People began to believe that Temujin would remember those who helped him when he was weak and reward them appropriately when he became strong. Chapter 6: Love, War, and Revenge. 1196 to 1201. Success bred success, but it also bred enemies. As Temujin's reputation grew and more warriors joined his banner, established powers began to see him as a genuine threat rather than a curious novelty. The old order of the steppes was built on predictable relationships between known quantities. Temujin represented something new and dangerous, a leader who refused to accept traditional limitations. The Merkids, humiliated by his rescue operation and the loss of face it had caused them, decided to strike back in the most personal way possible. They couldn't defeat him in open battle yet. His alliance with Toghrul made that too risky, but they could hurt him in a way that would destroy his reputation and make other tribes question whether he could protect those who trusted him. They spent months planning their revenge, gathering intelligence about Temujin's movements and the layout of his camps. They studied his habits, learned his routines, and waited for the perfect moment when he would be vulnerable to a surprise attack. That moment came when Temujin moved his main camp to better grazing lands near a river valley. The new location was strategically sound for defense against conventional attacks, but it was also isolated enough that help couldn't arrive quickly if something went wrong. The Merkids struck at dawn, timing their attack for the moment when most people would be asleep, but guards would be tired from their night watches. They came in overwhelming numbers, surrounding the camp before anyone realized what was happening. But Temujin wasn't their real target. They had something much more devastating in mind. They wanted Börte. Taking a Khan's wife was the ultimate insult in steppe culture, a blow to honor that could destroy a man's reputation forever. It announced to the world that the victim was too weak to protect his own family, too powerless to command respect, too insignificant to fear. Many leaders had been ruined by such attacks, their followers abandoning them for chiefs who could guarantee security. In the chaos of the attack, Börte showed the same courage that had made her wait for Temujin through years of exile. As Merkid warriors poured into the camp, she helped organize the defense of the women and children, making sure the youngest and weakest had time to escape into the forest. But there were too many attackers, and they had planned too carefully. Despite her resistance and the efforts of Temujin's guards, Börte was captured and carried away into slavery. The Merkids also took dozens of other captives, hundreds of horses, and everything valuable they could carry. When Temujin returned from a hunting trip and found his camp in ruins, his reaction shocked even his closest followers. He didn't rage or weep or make empty threats. Instead, he became utterly calm and spoke in a voice that made everyone around him understand they were seeing something terrifying. His response would define him as a leader for the rest of his life. He could have accepted the loss and moved on, as many Khans did when the cost of revenge seemed too high. The Merkids were numerous, well-armed, and had strong defensive positions. A rescue attempt might cost him most of his army and leave him weaker than before. Instead, he made a promise that would echo across the steppes. He would rescue his wife, no matter what it cost him, no matter how long it took, no matter who he had to destroy in the process. His followers would either help him keep this promise or find themselves new leaders. The speech he gave that night became legendary. He reminded his warriors that a man who couldn't protect his own wife couldn't protect anyone else's family either. He told them that backing down from this challenge would mark them all as cowards who could be attacked with impunity. Most importantly, he promised that the Merkids would pay such a terrible price for this insult that no other tribe would ever dare to repeat it. The rescue required everything he had learned about warfare, politics, and human nature. He couldn't defeat the Merkids alone. They had thousands of warriors and several well-fortified camps scattered across their territory. A direct assault would be suicide, and a siege would take months he didn't have. So he embarked on the most complex military and diplomatic campaign of his young career. He would form his first major military alliance, convincing multiple powers to join his cause and coordinate their efforts for maximum effect. The first ally was obvious. Toghrul owed him loyalty based on their relationship and would benefit from weakening the Merkids. But Toghrul was cautious and wouldn't commit his full strength without assurance that the campaign would succeed quickly and decisively. The second ally was more complicated. Jamukha, his childhood friend, who had grown into a powerful chief in his own right. Jamukha and Temujin had maintained their friendship despite increasingly competing for the same resources and followers. This campaign would test whether personal bonds could survive political ambitions. Convincing both men to join required different arguments. To Toghrul, he emphasized the practical benefits. The Merkids had been raiding Karaite territory for years, and this was a chance to settle old scores while helping an ally. To Jamukha, he appealed to personal loyalty and the bonds of their childhood friendship. But the real challenge was coordinating 3 separate armies with different leaders, different traditions, and different ideas about how warfare should be conducted. Temujin had to become not just a military commander, but a diplomat, negotiating everything from the timing of attacks to the division of captured wealth. The planning took weeks. Scouts mapped every Merkid camp, noting guard rotations, escape routes, and defensive positions. Spies infiltrated enemy territory to gather intelligence about where captives were being held and how they were guarded. Supply lines were established to keep 3 armies fed and equipped during a campaign that might last months. When everything was finally ready, the combined army struck like lightning. 3 separate forces hit different Merkid camps simultaneously, creating chaos and preventing any organized resistance. The attacks were timed to begin at the same moment across hundreds of miles, requiring precise coordination and flawless execution. The assault was so sudden and so overwhelming that the Merkids barely had time to grab their weapons before their entire world collapsed around them. Warriors who had been sleeping peacefully were suddenly fighting for their lives against enemies who seemed to appear from nowhere. Temujin led the charge against the largest camp personally, his sword cutting through anyone who stood between him and his goal. He moved through the battle like a man possessed, driven by fury that had been building for months. His followers, inspired by his example and terrified by his intensity, fought with desperate courage. But finding Börte in the chaos of multiple burning camps proved nearly impossible. Captives had been scattered across different locations, some hidden in secret places that might take days to discover. As dawn broke over the devastated Merkid territory, Temujin began to fear that his wife might have been killed in the fighting or moved to some distant location. He found her in the 3rd camp they overran, held in a tent that had been set aside for the most valuable prisoners. She was alive, defiant, and 8 months pregnant. The moment he saw her condition, Temujin understood the cruel genius of the Merkid's revenge. They hadn't just stolen his wife. They had created a situation that could haunt him for the rest of his life. The child growing inside her might be his, conceived before her capture, or it might belong to her captor, the Merkid chief who had claimed her as his prize. In a culture obsessed with bloodlines and legitimacy, this uncertainty could destroy both Temujin's reputation and his marriage. In that moment, with the tent burning around them and the sounds of battle still raging outside, Temujin made another choice that revealed his character. Looking into Börte's eyes, he told her it didn't matter whose blood the child carried. He would claim it as his own and raise it with the same love he would show any of his children. This decision shocked everyone who heard about it, including his own followers. Most Khans would have divorced a wife in such circumstances, or at least publicly questioned the child's parentage to protect their own reputations. By claiming the child regardless of its true father, Temujin showed a kind of loyalty and pragmatism that set him apart from conventional leaders. The victory established Temujin as a major power on the steppes. Warriors flocked to join him, drawn by his success and his reputation for rewarding loyalty generously. The speed and effectiveness of the Merkid campaign proved that he could plan and execute complex operations, while his treatment of Börte showed that he valued personal bonds over abstract principles of honor. But success also brought new challenges and new enemies. His alliance with Jamukha had accomplished its purpose, but it had also revealed how much both men had changed since their childhood. They were no longer boys playing at war, but grown men with armies, ambitions, and increasingly different ideas about how the steppes should be ruled. The tension between them began to show during the division of captured wealth from the Merkid victory. Both leaders claimed the largest share for their contributions to the campaign, and their followers began to mutter about unfair treatment and broken promises. The tension came to a head when their combined tribes camped together during a hunting expedition meant to celebrate their successful alliance. What should have been a joyful occasion became a test of wills as two groups of warriors competed for the best camping spots, the choicest hunting grounds, and their leaders' attention. A dispute broke out when some of Jamukha's men claimed a prime location near fresh water that Temujin's followers had already marked as their own. What started as arguments over practical matters quickly became questions about which leader deserved more respect, which army had fought more bravely, which chief had contributed more to their shared victory. The situation exploded when one of Jamukha's warriors, drunk on fermented mare's milk and frustrated by what he saw as disrespect from Temujin's men, killed one of Temujin's most trusted followers in a fight over horses. Jamukha, faced with a crisis that could destroy the alliance, demanded that Temujin hand over the man who had started the original argument. It was a reasonable request by traditional standards. Leaders were expected to discipline followers who caused problems between allied tribes. But Temujin refused. The man who had died was worth 10 of his killer, he said, and justice demanded blood for blood, not compromise for peace. In that refusal, both men recognized that their friendship was over. They were no longer allies, but rivals for control of the entire region, and only one of them could ultimately rule the steppes. Chapter 7, The Brothers' War, 1201 to 1205. The break with Jamukha split the steppes into two camps, creating a civil war that would reshape the entire region. Every tribe, every clan, every family had to choose: follow the traditional way of doing things under Jamukha, or gamble on the revolutionary ideas of Temujin. The choice would determine not just who lived or died, but what kind of world their children would inherit. The conflict went far deeper than personal rivalry between two former friends. It represented a fundamental clash between two completely different visions of how society should work, how power should be distributed, and what it meant to be a leader on the steppes. Jamukha represented everything the old nobility loved about steppe culture. He came from an ancient bloodline that could trace its ancestry back through generations of chiefs and heroes. He followed traditional customs without question, respected the established hierarchies that had governed tribal life for centuries, and believed that birth determined worth more than any personal accomplishment ever could. Under his rule, the world would remain predictable and stable. The sons of chiefs would become chiefs themselves, inheriting their father's wealth, followers, and responsibilities. The sons of herders would remain herders, caring for animals and serving their betters as their families had always done. Everyone would know their place, and that place would never change. This system appealed to those who already held power or who benefited from traditional relationships. Established chiefs saw Jamukha as someone who would preserve their privileges and protect them from upstart challengers. Wealthy families believed he would maintain the customs that had made them prosperous. Even some common people preferred the certainty of knowing exactly what their lives would be like, even if those lives would never improve. Temujin offered something entirely different, a meritocracy where talent could triumph over tradition. He promoted men based on their abilities rather than their ancestry, creating opportunities for advancement that had never existed before. Former slaves could become generals if they proved themselves in battle. Herders could become administrators if they showed intelligence and loyalty. Outcasts could find honor and wealth if they were willing to fight for it. This revolutionary approach terrified the old elite, but excited everyone else. For the first time in steppe history, a man's future wasn't determined by the circumstances of his birth. Courage, intelligence, and dedication could lift someone from the lowest station to the highest ranks of society. The transformation in Temujin's army was dramatic. Warriors who had been ignored by traditional leaders because of their humble origins found themselves commanding respect and responsibility. Men who had been dismissed as worthless outcasts discovered they had valuable skills that were desperately needed. Most importantly, everyone understood that their success depended on the army's success, creating a unity of purpose that traditional hierarchies could never match. But this new system also created intense pressure. In the old world, mediocrity was acceptable as long as you were born into the right family. In Temujin's world, everyone had to prove themselves constantly or risk being replaced by someone more capable. The opportunity for advancement came with the possibility of falling just as quickly. The first major battle between the two systems took place at Dalan Balzhut, a valley that had seen countless smaller conflicts, but nothing approaching this scale. Both armies were roughly equal in size, perhaps 13,000 men each, but they fought for completely different reasons and with completely different expectations. Jamukha's men fought to preserve their place in the traditional order that had given meaning to their lives. They were defending not just their leader, but their entire way of understanding the world. Victory would confirm that the old ways were still the best ways, that change was unnecessary and dangerous. Many of Jamukha's warriors were better equipped than their opponents, with superior weapons, armor, and horses inherited from generations of successful ancestors. They had been trained in traditional tactics that had proven effective for centuries. Most importantly, they fought with the confidence that came from knowing they were defending the natural order of things. Temujin's followers fought for the chance to rise higher than their fathers ever could, to break free from limitations that had constrained their families for generations. They were fighting not just for victory in this battle, but for the right to remake the world according to their own abilities, rather than accepting the roles they had been born into. These men brought a different kind of intensity to the battlefield. They understood that defeat meant not just death, but the end of the only opportunity they would ever have to escape their predetermined fate. Victory, on the other hand, could open doors that had been closed to people like them for centuries. The battle raged for an entire day without a clear victor, both armies displaying the fierce courage that made steppe warriors legendary across the known world. Jamukha's forces were disciplined and experienced, executing complex maneuvers with precision developed through years of traditional training. But Temujin's warriors fought with the desperation and creativity of men who had everything to gain and nothing to lose. They adapted quickly to changing circumstances, took risks that conventional wisdom would have condemned, and supported each other with a brotherhood that transcended traditional clan loyalties. As the sun began to set over a battlefield littered with the dead and wounded from both sides, neither army had achieved a decisive victory. Both leaders had proven they could command respect and inspire loyalty. Both had demonstrated tactical skill and personal courage. The conflict was far from over, but in the aftermath of battle, the differences between the two leaders became even more apparent. Jamukha, following ancient customs about the treatment of enemies, ordered the captured opponents to be executed in the most painful and humiliating way possible. The prisoners were boiled alive in giant cauldrons, a traditional punishment meant to ensure that their spirits could never find peace in the afterlife. The executions took hours, with the victims screaming in agony while Jamukha's followers watched approvingly. This was justice as their ancestors had understood it, complete, terrible, and final. The brutality was meant to terrify future opponents and demonstrate the futility of opposing traditional authority. But it had the opposite effect on many who witnessed it. Even some of Jamukha's own warriors were sickened by the cruelty, beginning to question whether such methods were necessary or wise. More importantly, word of the execution spread quickly across the steppes, creating exactly the kind of fear Jamukha had intended. But fear, they discovered, was not the same as respect or loyalty. People began to whisper that a leader who needed such brutality to maintain control might not be as strong as he appeared. Meanwhile, Temujin treated his prisoners with unexpected mercy that confused and impressed everyone who heard about it. Instead of executing them or demanding ransoms for their release, he offered them a choice that no one had expected. They could join his army and be welcomed as brothers, with the same opportunities for advancement as any of his original followers. Or they could return home with their weapons and their lives, free to tell others about what they had experienced. Most chose to stay, bringing not just additional manpower, but valuable intelligence about Jamukha's plans, tactics, and weaknesses. The former prisoners also brought credible testimony about the differences between the two camps. They could speak from personal experience about which leader offered better opportunities, which army provided better treatment for ordinary warriors, and which cause seemed more likely to succeed in the long run. The contrast couldn't have been clearer to anyone paying attention. One leader ruled through fear and tradition, maintaining discipline through the threat of horrible punishment and relying on ancient customs to justify his authority. The other ruled through opportunity and respect, creating loyalty by giving people reasons to fight willingly rather than forcing them to fight through terror. Word spread quickly across the steppes about which approach was more effective at building the kind of lasting loyalty that could survive military setbacks and political challenges. Traditional chiefs began to worry that their own followers might start questioning whether they deserved obedience simply because of their bloodlines. Over the following months, defections began slowly but steadily. First, a few individual warriors, disillusioned with traditional leadership or attracted by stories of opportunity in Temujin's camp. Then small groups of families seeking better lives for their children. Finally, entire clans started abandoning Jamukha for Temujin, bringing with them their weapons, their animals, and their knowledge of the region. Each group that switched sides brought stories of the opportunities available to anyone willing to prove their worth in the new order that was taking shape. They spoke of former slaves who had become trusted advisors, of herders who had been promoted to command positions, of outcasts who had found honor and wealth through loyalty and competence. These stories created a snowball effect that traditional leaders found impossible to stop. The more people defected to Temujin, the more attractive his cause became to others who were considering their options. Success bred success. While Jamukha's harsh methods began to look less like strength and more like desperation, the defections also brought practical advantages that went beyond simple numbers. Each new group provided intelligence about Jamukha's remaining strongholds, knowledge about the loyalties of tribes that hadn't yet chosen sides, and connections that could be used to convince others to join Temujin's growing coalition. Perhaps most importantly, the steady stream of defectors proved that Temujin's revolutionary ideas weren't just appealing in theory, they worked in practice. People were willing to risk everything to join his movement. And once they joined, they remained loyal even when facing serious challenges. This was the kind of proof that skeptics found impossible to argue with. Chapter 8, Master of the Steppes, 1201 to 1206. Victory over Jamukha was just the beginning of an even greater challenge. Temujin now controlled most of the Mongol tribes, but the steppes contained dozens of other peoples: Tatars, Merkids, Naimans, Karaites, and many smaller groups, each with their own armies, territories, and burning ambitions for dominance. To survive in this world of constant warfare, he would have to conquer them all. The task seemed impossible. Even with his growing reputation and expanding army, Temujin was still vastly outnumbered by the combined forces of his potential enemies. Worse, these groups had learned from his success against Jamukha and were forming their own alliances specifically designed to stop his rise to power. Traditional steppe warfare, massed cavalry charges, siege tactics, and seasonal campaigns wouldn't be enough against such overwhelming opposition. His enemies expected him to fight conventionally, and they had prepared accordingly. Temujin needed something revolutionary, tactics that no one had seen before, strategies that would give his smaller armies decisive advantages over much larger forces. He found his answer by studying the fundamental assumptions that govern steppe warfare and systematically challenging each one. Where others saw limitations, he saw opportunities. Where convention demanded one approach, he deliberately chose another. The first innovation was speed and deception on a scale that had never been attempted before. While other armies moved slowly and fought predictably, following seasonal patterns that everyone understood, Temujin's forces became ghosts on the steppes. They could appear anywhere, strike without warning, and vanish before enemies could organize an effective response. This required completely rethinking how armies were supplied and organized. Traditional forces moved slowly because they had to bring everything with them: food, weapons, spare equipment, families, and herds. Temujin created fast-moving strike forces that lived off the land, carried only essential equipment, and could cover distances in days that would take conventional armies weeks. His scouts became legendary for their ability to gather intelligence across vast distances. They could track enemy movements, identify weaknesses in defensive positions, and report back with information that allowed Temujin to strike where and when his opponents least expected it. But the real key to his success was a revolutionary command structure that broke with thousands of years of steppe tradition. Instead of the conventional system where chiefs led their own tribesmen in battle, creating armies that were essentially collections of separate tribal units, Temujin mixed warriors from different backgrounds into entirely new formations. He organized his army into decimal units, squads of 10 men, companies of 100, and regiments of 1,000. But the crucial innovation was that these units deliberately combined warriors from different tribes, clans, and backgrounds. Men who had been enemies months earlier now fought side by side, depending on each other for survival. This system created several advantages that his enemies couldn't match. First, it destroyed the old tribal loyalties that had made steppe armies unreliable in crisis. When a traditional chief was killed or decided to switch sides, his entire tribal contingent would leave the battlefield. In Temujin's army, the death or defection of any individual couldn't cause a mass exodus because the units were integrated across tribal lines. Second, it created a genuine meritocracy where promotion was based on battlefield performance rather than birth or political connections. The best fighters and tactical thinkers rose through the ranks regardless of their origins, creating a leadership class that was fiercely loyal to Temujin personally because he had given them opportunities they never could have achieved under traditional systems. Third, it forced different groups to learn from each other. Tactics, weapons, and strategies that had been tribal secrets for generations were now shared throughout the army. The result was a military force that combined the best elements from dozens of different warrior traditions into something more effective than any of them had been individually. His first major tactical innovation was the feigned retreat, a maneuver that turned apparent defeat into crushing victory. The concept was simple, but required perfect timing and coordination that most armies couldn't achieve. His forces, would attack an enemy army with apparent desperation, engage briefly in fierce combat, then suddenly break and run as if they were being overwhelmed by superior numbers. The key was making the retreat look completely genuine. Temujin's warriors had to convince their enemies that they were genuinely panicking and fleeing in disorder, not executing a planned maneuver. This required acting skills as much as military discipline, and months of practice to perfect. The enemy, seeing what appeared to be a clear victory, would break formation and pursue the fleeing Mongols. Individual warriors and small units would race ahead, eager to claim trophies and glory from what seemed like a beaten enemy. Traditional battle formations would collapse as the pursuit became a chaotic race to catch the retreating forces. But the fleeing Mongols were leading their pursuers directly into carefully prepared killing grounds. Hidden archer units waited in hills and ravines along the retreat route. Reserve cavalry forces were positioned to cut off escape routes once the trap was sprung. What had appeared to be a disorganized flight was actually a carefully choreographed dance of death. The Tatars became the first major victim of this revolutionary strategy. These were the same people who had poisoned Temujin's father years earlier, creating the crisis that had destroyed his family and forced them into exile. The opportunity for revenge had finally arrived, and Temujin planned to make it memorable. The campaign began with months of careful preparation. Scouts mapped every Tatar settlement, identified their military leaders, and studied their tactical preferences. Spies infiltrated their camps to gather intelligence about troop numbers, defensive positions, and internal politics that might be exploited. When Temujin finally struck, his forces seemed to attack with reckless desperation, as if he was so eager for revenge that he had abandoned all tactical sense. The initial assault was fierce but disorganized, exactly what the Tatars expected from an emotional young leader seeking personal vengeance. When the Mongol forces suddenly broke and fled in apparent panic, the Tatar warriors felt vindicated in their assessment. They had defeated the supposedly unstoppable Temujin, proving that his reputation was built on luck rather than skill. They pursued eagerly, thinking they were about to end the threat he represented once and for all. But they were running straight into hidden archer units positioned in the hills and reserve cavalry forces, waiting in concealed positions. The retreat route had been carefully planned to channel the pursuing Tatars into narrow valleys where they couldn't maneuver effectively and couldn't escape when the trap was revealed. By the time the Tatars realized what was happening, it was too late to retreat or reorganize their scattered forces. Arrows rained down from hidden positions, while cavalry units closed off every escape route. The pursuit turned into a slaughter that left Tatar military power permanently broken. The victory was more than military. It was deeply personal and symbolically important. These were the people who had killed his father through treachery, starting the chain of events that had cost his family everything. Temujin's revenge was methodical and complete, designed to ensure that the Tatars could never again pose a threat to him or his people. Following ancient traditions of steppe warfare, every Tatar male taller than a cartwheel was executed. This wasn't random cruelty, but calculated policy designed to eliminate the possibility of future rebellion. Adult males might someday seek revenge for their defeat, but children could be raised as Mongols and become loyal members of the new order. The executions took days to complete and were carried out with systematic efficiency that impressed and terrified observers. Temujin wanted everyone to understand that betraying him or harming his family would result in consequences that extended far beyond individual punishment. But he showed calculated mercy to the women and children, demonstrating the same practical intelligence that had made him successful in other areas. Dead enemies couldn't serve him, but former enemies could become his most loyal followers if they were treated with respect and given genuine opportunities to prove themselves. The surviving Tatars were absorbed into his forces using the same integration methods that had proven successful with other conquered peoples. Children were raised as Mongols from birth, learning to see Temujin as their natural leader. Women married Mongol warriors, creating family connections that bound the former enemies together. Even adult survivors could earn respect and advancement through loyal service. This combination of ruthless elimination of threats with generous treatment of those who submitted became Temujin's signature approach to conquest. It sent a clear message to future opponents. Resistance meant destruction, but submission meant opportunity. The choice was theirs, but the consequences would be exactly what his reputation promised. Chapter 9: The Universal Ruler, 1206. By 1206, Temujin had achieved what seemed impossible just decades earlier. The fractured tribes of Mongolia were united under a single leader for the first time in their recorded history. But this unification represented far more than just military conquest. It was the birth of a new kind of state that would revolutionize how entire civilizations thought about power, society, and human potential. The transformation had taken nearly 2 decades of constant warfare, careful diplomacy, and revolutionary thinking. Tribes that had been enemies for centuries were now working together. Warriors who had grown up believing that their clan was their entire world now saw themselves as a part of something vastly larger and more significant. But Temujin understood that unification was just the beginning of an even greater challenge. He now controlled perhaps 1 million people scattered across the vast steppes of Mongolia, but they were still organized according to the old tribal system that had kept them divided and weak for generations. To create something truly powerful, he would need to transform not just how they fought, but how they thought about themselves and their place in the world. The Great Assembly, called a kurultai, gathered on the banks of the Onon River in the spring of 1206. This was no ordinary meeting, but a gathering that brought together representatives from every tribe, clan, and conquered people across the steppes. Chiefs who had been sworn enemies for decades sat together in the same circle. Warriors from dozens of different backgrounds shared the same fires and ate from the same cooking pots. The assembly lasted for days, with speeches, ceremonies, and debates that would determine the future of an entire civilization. Traditional shamans performed rituals blessing the new order. Former enemies publicly swore oaths of loyalty that their ancestors would have found unthinkable. Most importantly, they addressed the question of what to call their new supreme leader and what kind of authority he would exercise. The title they chose was unprecedented in steppe history, Genghis Khan, which meant something like universal ruler or ruler of all. This wasn't just a name, but a statement of ambition that shocked even his closest followers. Previous steppe leaders had been content to rule their own tribes, or perhaps dominate a region. Genghis Khan was claiming authority over everyone, everywhere. The proclamation ceremony itself was designed to emphasize the revolutionary nature of what was happening. Instead of following traditional customs where a new chief was acclaimed by his own tribesmen, Genghis Khan was proclaimed by representatives of all the peoples he had conquered. His authority came not from his birth or his clan connections, but from his proven ability to unite and lead diverse groups of people. But Genghis Khan understood that titles and ceremonies meant nothing without the institutional power to enforce them. His first act as supreme leader was to completely reorganize Mongol society from top to bottom, implementing changes so radical that they amounted to a complete social revolution. The old tribal system that had governed the steppes for over 1,000 years was abolished in a single day. Ancient clan structures, traditional hierarchies, and hereditary positions of authority were swept away and replaced with something entirely new. In its place, he created a structure based entirely on merit, loyalty, and competence. The army became the foundation of everything, not just military campaigns, but government, law enforcement, social organization, and economic management. Every adult male had a place in the decimal system, organized into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors. But the crucial innovation was that these military units became the basic structure of civil society as well. The same officers who led men in battle also governed their communities in peacetime, collected taxes, administered justice, and organized large-scale projects. Military rank determined social status, political authority, and access to resources. This system created several advantages that no previous steppe society had enjoyed. First, it eliminated the constant feuding between clans and tribes that had weakened the Mongols for centuries. When people's primary loyalty was to their military unit rather than their birth family, ancient grudges became irrelevant. Second, it created genuine social mobility on a scale that had been impossible under traditional systems. A herder's son who showed exceptional courage and intelligence in battle could rise through the ranks to become a general commanding thousands of men. A former slave who demonstrated loyalty and competence could achieve positions of respect and authority that his birth would never have allowed. Third, it unified the entire population around a common purpose and shared identity. Instead of seeing themselves as members of competing tribes who happened to live in the same region, the Mongols now understood themselves as a single people with a common destiny. The transformation was breathtaking in its scope and speed. Ancient feuds between tribes that had lasted for generations were declared forgotten and forbidden. Prisoners of war were not just spared, but welcomed as full citizens with the same rights and opportunities as anyone else. Former enemies could rise to the highest positions in government and military leadership if they proved their worth through service and loyalty. Laws were established that reinforced the new meritocratic system. Theft from fellow Mongols was punishable by death, creating a level of internal security that made trade and cooperation possible across vast distances. Desertion from military service was also a capital crime, ensuring that the army remained disciplined and reliable. But perhaps most importantly, religious tolerance was mandated throughout the empire. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and traditional shamanists were all given equal protection under Mongol law. This wasn't just humanitarian policy, but practical politics. Conquered peoples were much more likely to accept Mongol rule if their fundamental beliefs and practices were respected. The psychological transformation was even more significant than the institutional changes. Genghis Khan convinced an entire people that they were destined to rule the world, chosen by the eternal blue sky to bring all nations under Mongol authority. This wasn't just propaganda, but a carefully crafted worldview that gave meaning and purpose to every aspect of Mongol life. They weren't conquering other peoples out of greed or cruelty, but to fulfill their sacred responsibility to create a unified world under divine guidance. The Mongols, who had been dismissed by civilized nations as primitive barbarians living in felt tents and surviving on mare's milk, now saw themselves as the most advanced and enlightened people on earth. They possessed superior military technology, more effective government systems, and a moral authority that came from heaven itself. This belief transformed everything about how they approached warfare and diplomacy. They weren't just raiding for wealth or fighting for territory. They were fulfilling their sacred destiny to bring order, justice, and prosperity to the entire world under Mongol rule. This sense of divine mission made them psychologically unstoppable in ways that superior weapons or tactics alone never could have achieved. When Mongol warriors rode into battle, they fought not just for personal glory or material reward, but for the cosmic purpose that gave their lives ultimate meaning. The combination of revolutionary social organization with unshakable belief in their own destiny created something unprecedented in world history. A nomadic people who saw themselves as the natural rulers of sedentary civilizations. Barbarians who were convinced they were more civilized than the empires they planned to conquer. The first target for this new kind of conquest was obvious: China. The Jin dynasty controlled northern China with armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, protected by walls and fortifications that had stood for centuries and never been breached by foreign invaders. The Chinese saw the Mongols as a minor annoyance at best, primitive barbarians who periodically emerged from the steppes to raid border settlements before retreating back to their nomadic lifestyle. They could be managed through the traditional methods that had worked for centuries, paying tribute to keep them quiet, playing different tribal leaders against each other, and occasionally mounting punitive expeditions to remind them of Chinese military superiority. But they were about to discover that everything they thought they knew about steppe peoples was wrong. The Mongols were no longer just another collection of tribal raiders. They had become something entirely new, a unified military machine with revolutionary tactics, absolute discipline, and an unshakable belief that conquering China was not just possible, but inevitable. Chapter 10. Conqueror of Worlds, 1206 to 1227. The conquest of China began not with massive battles, but with a single devastating message that would change the course of world history. Genghis Khan sent ambassadors to the Jin Emperor with an ultimatum that shocked the Chinese court. Submit to Mongol authority and retain your throne as a vassal ruler, or face complete destruction of everything you have built. The message was delivered with typical Mongol directness. There would be no negotiations, no compromises, no face-saving alternatives. The emperor could choose between survival and annihilation, but those were the only options available. The emperor's response was entirely predictable to anyone who understood Chinese imperial culture. He laughed at the barbarians' audacity and had the ambassadors executed as an insult to the dignity of the Celestial Empire. How dare these primitive nomads imagine they could threaten the most advanced civilization on Earth? This was exactly the excuse Genghis Khan had been waiting for. He now had perfect justification for total war against an empire that had refused his generous offer of peaceful submission. The execution of his ambassadors meant that any mercy he might have shown was no longer required by steppe law or diplomatic custom. The Mongol invasion of China that followed revolutionized siege warfare forever. For centuries, Chinese military strategy had been built around massive walls and fortified cities that could withstand any assault by nomadic raiders. Traditional steppe peoples had always been forced to retreat when they encountered serious fortifications because they lacked the technology and expertise needed for successful sieges. But Genghis Khan had learned from every enemy he had ever faced, and he had absorbed Chinese defectors who understood both military systems intimately. While Chinese armies huddled behind their supposedly impregnable walls, feeling safe in fortifications that had protected their ancestors for generations, Mongol engineers developed entirely new techniques for breaching defenses that had never been seriously tested. The Mongols adapted Chinese siege engines and improved them, creating catapults and trebuchets that could hurl massive stones farther and more accurately than anything the defenders had seen before. They used Chinese gunpowder technology to create explosives that could blast through walls that had withstood conventional attacks for centuries. More importantly, they developed systematic approaches to siege warfare that combined multiple techniques simultaneously. While some units attacked the walls directly, others diverted rivers to flood defensive positions or undermine foundations. Engineers dug tunnels beneath fortifications, while archers provided covering fire from mobile shields that could be moved closer to the walls than anyone thought possible. But the real innovation was psychological warfare on a scale that had never been attempted before. Genghis Khan realized that fear could accomplish more than catapults or explosives, and he developed methods for terrorizing entire populations that made physical resistance seem pointless. The strategy was brilliantly simple. Cities that surrendered immediately were treated with remarkable mercy and incorporated into the growing empire with their populations and wealth intact. Residents who submitted willingly were protected, their property was respected, and their leaders were allowed to retain their positions under Mongol oversight. But cities that resisted were utterly destroyed with systematic thoroughness that left no doubt about the consequences of defying Mongol authority. Not only were the fortifications leveled and the defenders killed, but the entire population was either slaughtered or scattered, and the city itself was often burned so completely that it could never be rebuilt in the same location. These destructions were not random acts of violence, but carefully planned demonstrations designed to terrorize future opponents into submission. Genghis Khan understood that destroying one city completely would save him from having to fight 10 others, because word of the destruction would spread faster than his armies could march. The strategy worked with terrifying effectiveness. As news spread of entire cities being erased from existence, populations killed, buildings demolished, even the irrigation systems destroyed so the land itself became uninhabitable, resistance began to crumble across northern China. Chinese commanders who had sworn oaths of loyalty to the emperor began making desperate calculations about whether their duty to a distant ruler was worth the complete annihilation of everything they had spent their lives protecting. Many decided it wasn't, opening their gates to Mongol forces and switching sides rather than watching their cities burn. The psychological impact extended far beyond military considerations. Chinese scholars and officials who had spent centuries looking down on nomadic peoples as primitive barbarians were forced to confront the reality that these supposedly inferior people had developed more effective methods of warfare than the most advanced civilization on Earth. Within a single decade, northern China had fallen to a nomadic people that Chinese intellectuals had dismissed as savage nomads living in felt tents and surviving on mare's milk and fermented drinks. The Jin dynasty, which had ruled northern China for over a century and controlled millions of people, was reduced to a desperate rump state, clinging to survival in the south. The speed and completeness of the conquest shocked the entire known world. Chinese military technology, Chinese fortifications, Chinese numerical superiority, and Chinese cultural confidence had all proven useless against Mongol tactics and Mongol determination. But Genghis Khan's ambitions extended far beyond conquering China. Impressive as that achievement was, his armies were already turning west towards Central Asia, where the wealthy Khwarezmid Empire controlled the lucrative trade routes that connected east and west. The conquest of Khwarezm began with another diplomatic incident that escalated into total war. When Mongol merchants were murdered by a Khwarezmid governor and the Shah refused to hand over the perpetrators, Genghis Khan unleashed the full fury of his military machine against cities that had never seen anything like Mongol warfare. The systematic destruction of cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv demonstrated that the Mongol war machine had become even more efficient since the Chinese campaigns. Entire populations were eliminated with industrial precision that left these once great centers of Islamic civilization as empty ruins that would take centuries to rebuild. The conquest of Central Asia opened the door to further expansion westward as Mongol armies probed into the Caucasus and the edges of Eastern Europe. Everywhere they went, they encountered the same pattern: initial disbelief that nomadic barbarians could threaten civilized peoples, followed by devastating defeats that shattered entire kingdoms. By the time of Genghis Khan's death, in 1227, he controlled an empire that stretched from Korea in the east to the Caspian Sea in the west, encompassing more territory than any previous ruler in human history had even imagined possible. Millions of people who had never heard of Mongolia now lived under Mongol law. But his greatest achievement wasn't the vast territory he had conquered through 2 decades of continuous warfare. It was the governmental and military system he had created that would allow his successors to expand that empire until it covered most of the known world. The decimal military organization, the merit-based promotion system, the religious tolerance, the efficient communication networks, and most importantly, the unshakable belief that Mongols were destined to rule the earth. All of these innovations would survive his death and continue driving expansion for generations. His sons and grandsons would conquer the rest of China, destroy the Islamic Caliphate in Baghdad, overrun Russia and Eastern Europe, and create the largest contiguous land empire in human history. The system Genghis Khan created was so effective that it continued working perfectly even without his personal leadership. The boy who had been born holding a blood clot in his fist, who had survived betrayal by trusted allies, starvation in the wilderness, imprisonment by enemies, and exile from his own people, who had transformed himself from powerless outcast to universal ruler, had fulfilled the shaman's prophecy in ways that no one could have imagined when they first saw that ominous sign. His empire would eventually stretch from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, from Siberia to Southeast Asia, encompassing more territory and more people than Rome at its height, more than Alexander's conquests, more than any other ruler before or since. The Mongol legal code would influence laws across multiple continents. The trade routes his armies secured would connect east and west for centuries, enabling cultural and technological exchanges that reshaped human civilization. The religious tolerance he mandated would protect Christians in Muslim lands and Muslims in Christian territories, creating unprecedented cooperation between different faiths. The communications systems he established would allow information to travel faster across his empire than it moved anywhere else on Earth. But perhaps, most remarkably, genetic studies have revealed that the DNA of the man who started life as an abandoned child on the Mongolian steppes can still be found in roughly 16 million people alive today, scattered across Asia and beyond, a biological testament to just how completely one person's vision and determination can reshape the entire world. The shamans who had interpreted that blood clot as a sign of future conquest had been absolutely right. But even their supernatural insight could not have predicted the true scale of what that newborn child would accomplish, or how thoroughly his legacy would influence the course of human history for centuries after his death. The blood clot had indeed been a prophecy. The boy born to spill blood had become the man who conquered the world. As Genghis Khan's eyes closed for the final time in 1227, his generals gathered around his deathbed to hear his last words. What he told them about the secret location of his tomb the future of the empire, and the conquest still to come would determine whether his life's work would die with him or continue growing until Mongol armies stood at the gates of Vienna and the shores of Japan. But that revelation, and the story of how his successors would conquer lands he never even knew existed, belongs to another night.